Hi folks, it's Thinking Slow. I wanted to do a quick video about what President Putin actually said last night, which is the 21st of February, before he declared or recognized the Lugansk People's Republic and the Donetsk People's Republic. And the reason I wanted to do that is because what he actually said is not reflected in any way in obviously the Western media and a lot of the comments that you get through Twitter and other social media, which is talking about a sort of rambling, crazy speech, which is not true at all. I think much of what he said makes sense. So I'm going to quickly do a summary of that because it did go on for an hour, but this is what we were able to get as short bullet points, and then you can decide for yourselves whether it's crazy or not. So to start with, though, that Ukraine is quite a complicated country. You could spend many months probably studying the history of Ukraine and not fully understand all the ins and outs. The politics are a dreadful mess, and it's very difficult to work out who's doing what there. But in this picture here, there is a bit of a clear sort of split that you can see between the East and the West, and this is sort of Ukraine's Achilles heel. The East is predominantly Russian ethnic, Russian-speaking, and the West is mainly Ukrainian and Ukrainian-speaking. And I mean, that survived fine during Soviet times because it's all part of one big sort of happy family. I use the term loosely, but unfortunately, since independence, then these tensions have flared up, obviously, and that's the basis of the problems today. And this split is also reflected in political views. So when there's two presidents running for election, the voting splits almost exactly down these lines. And the split of affiliation between EU versus affiliation with Russia is almost also split down these lines. So the actual numbers of ethnic Russians are about 17%, or just sort of 8.3 million people, and this is a significant problem of having a majority potentially oppressing a minority, and there's a big question here about how, let's to be friendly, say assertive the Ukrainian side is on insisting on this and on insisting on sort of Ukrainian only, not teaching Russian, and basically oppressing Russian culture inside Ukraine. That's the crux of the problem, and the geographic split makes this situation that's difficult to resolve. So that's in a nutshell the background, and I would very much recommend looking at this video. It's from 2015. I haven't watched it all yet, but this is a screen grab, and it goes through all of those splits basically. So that's the background to what President Putin actually said. And if you read, you won't see this anywhere in the Western media, and if you see comments on Twitter, they will grossly represent what he said. The speech went on for an hour. I'm trying to just summarize it in a few minutes of the key points. So the summary is not 100% accurate, but it's reasonably close. He starts off from sort of day one of Ukrainian history. But I think we could skip up to the Soviet times, where he essentially said there was a slight problem in the documentation of the Soviet states, was that they could potentially easily become independent. But the de facto management of the Soviet states, where they were not in any way independent and very harsh running from the center under Joseph Stalin, and that was a historic reality. He then said essentially that when there was a breakaway from the Soviet Union, which by the way he recognizes, of course, there's no revisionism there, that there were elements of nationalism everywhere, and that was a strong movement in Ukraine as well. His view of the sort of Soviet relations with Ukraine is they were always supportive, and the support came in various forms, including sort of discounted gas prices. And he mentioned Ukraine was one of the few countries where it's difficult to get agreement on Soviet issues about splitting external debt and splitting external assets, so that Russia basically took on all of the Soviet debt, but at the same time Russia was then supposed to get the foreign assets of the various states, and that turned into a difficult conversation. And that's really the beginning of the background to the various problems that I mentioned between East and West. He mentioned some quite bad instances of violence in the war in 2014, and obviously things that that they're not going to. The Russian side, I suppose it's the same on the other side, is not going to forget in a hurry. So these are very deep and bitter divisions now because of those, because of that violence. His view on NATO was essentially that there'd been a long history of broken promises, and he went back to the 1990s with the breakup of the Soviet Union, and this phrase that NATO will not move 1 inch eastwards is actually confirmed, and the UK journalist Peter Hitchens has sent out a link to some documents that have been archived documents that confirms over and over again in discussions with Mikhail Gorbachev that NATO would not move eastwards, and there's no intention for that to happen. So it was the Soviet Union was assured that there wouldn't be eastward expansion of NATO. But in reality, what's happened is he said he's seen 5 waves of NATO expansion, and he is essentially saying that you may as well push that process forward where NATO is going, and that eventually it will become an aggressive presence in Ukraine. And although today, someone can give assurances that it won't be in NATO in the next year or so, on any kind of historic perspective, those assurances mean nothing because it's just a question of time. And I think he's extrapolating where they are today and saying this has to be dealt with. There's no point in kidding yourself that, okay, it's not today, but it might be tomorrow, or it might be next year, in 10 years' time. It has to be dealt with, essentially. And he also went through some timings of what would happen with various types of missile if it was based in Ukraine. And if I'm not mistaken, I think he mentioned a Tomahawk missile being in Moscow in 4 minutes or so. And he went through various other areas that could be hit inside Russia from Ukraine. So rightly or wrongly, he sees this as a threatening posture, and that's the reality. But surprisingly, at the end, his most surprising conclusion maybe was that actually this has not got much to do with Ukraine or even Russia or sanctions or Donetsk. It's actually just got a lot to do with hawks in the West not wanting Russia to develop, full stop. So he said the sanctions will be imposed come sort of hell or high water, irrespective of anything we do or don't do. So it's slightly fatalistic point of view, but this was really the points that he talked through. And with that view, you may as well go on the front foot. There's if you believe these things, then there's no benefit to sitting around waiting or looking for goodwill from the other side. It's just not going to happen. And just looking, this has all been, of course, through the West presented one way, that this was all Russia asserting itself and being aggressive. But if you look through the timetable of what NATO was up to in January and February, here's just a few things that were done in the last few months. So beginning of January, Alliance is going to look to further increase our presence in the eastern part of the alliance. 24th of January, NATO nations deploy aircraft and naval assets to East Europe and Baltic Sea. 30th of January, UK considering major military deployment, defensive weapons to Estonia. Early February, US is going to send 3,000 troops to Romania, Poland and Germany for defensive posture on eastern flank. again, early February, adjustments to our posture, our presence in the eastern part of the alliance, and mid-February, considering establishing new NATO battle groups in Central and Eastern, Southeastern Europe. So, this is definitely a situation that at best is being ratcheted up by both sides. You can take a personal view whether you think it's reasonable that all this is going on, having US, UK and other troops, the Netherlands, Spain, it's stationed in all these adjoining countries. And actually in the analysis of NATO movements, it actually says somewhere in one of the briefings that we are now present in 8 countries surrounding Ukraine and Russia. So there's no question that the NATO side of this has inflamed the situation. And we also had on our other videos various tweets from the Atlantic Council designed to inflame as much as possible the situation. And NATO's core argument is essentially that every country has territorial integrity and should have the free right to make whatever security and other arrangements it wants. But of course, we all understand now that's completely hypocritical, and we just have to say Iraq as one example. But in this study, you can see that in sort of 40-odd years, the United States has had regime change in 72 different occasions, with 66 covert operations and 6 overt ones. So we all know that the idea that the West actually respects territorial integrity is not serious. And if you want one particular example, Cuba's a good one, where they decided to enter into security arrangements with the Soviet Union, and look what happened there. Basically, there was no respecting any territorial integrity or freedom to enter into military alliances. So just wrapping up, another big question we raised, and this has not gone the way we expected. One thing NATO advertises is shared values, but looking at France and Canada and the UK last year, there's very big questions about liberty and democracy and freedom in those countries, with vaccine mandates, lockdowns, and all kinds of other withdrawal of individual rights in those countries. So, I mean, we have I've made this into a slight joke, the situation in Canada where you're basically cut off from the banking system because someone doesn't like your protesting and your political views. It is supposed to be semi-funny, but actually it's very, very serious. This is unheard of oppression of ordinary folks for demonstrating. This massively weakens any sort of moral authority NATO might have for saying, look, we're coming with democracy and shared values. It was always a bit of a weak argument, but given what's going on in the sort of tyrannical COVID response, that now looks even more dubious than it did in the past. So just finishing up then, what the Russians have essentially asked for is they don't want to see NATO expansion. They don't want strike weapons placed to threaten Russia, and they want to return essentially to a 1997 position. And as we said on the video a couple of days ago, they actually acknowledge progress on these strike weapons, but there's nothing on the non-expansion of NATO, and there's nothing much here about going back to some kind of pre-2022 position. And where does that essentially leave Russia? So I'm guessing here, but what it could be is that they decided that the Minsk agreements were effectively dead, because one of the main purposes, apart from a ceasefire, was to organize a loose federation of states or regions within Ukraine that could be more or less self-governing under a central federal authority. But as soon as the constitution was changed to put Ukraine on track for NATO membership, you'd already alienated that eastern side of the country, and there was sort of no going back from that, really. I think at that point the idea of a loose federation was gone, because again you're coercing a minority into things that they don't want to do, and something as serious as NATO membership, that's quite serious essentially. I think they'd also decided, probably reasonably, that massive increase in NATO presence, huge shifts eastward, and you're essentially boxed in, and just sit there and wait and watch the situation deteriorate was kind of pointless. And they had their own intelligence who knows that there was a threat to the people's republics of Donetsk and Luhansk. So they took action to protect ethnic Russians in those areas. So again, going back to the summary of the speech, the real bottom line could be, you could argue it's fatalistic, but if Putin's conclusion was the West, or elements in the West, don't want Russia to develop as a standalone country, then there's really nothing much to lose by not participating in this process. So why keep going on negotiations with NATO that really go nowhere? Why keep waiting to be further and further encircled? So they took a preemptive move, and you can disagree or agree with that, but that's essentially what they did. And that's out of President Putin's speech that in many ways makes sense, I think, to a number of people. And I think critically from this video, one thing we wanted to say is there is no black and white with this situation. There's lots of shades of grey, and in many ways, personally, I have sympathy with this position, that it seems a lot more reasonable than what our leaders are up to in some of these NATO member states. I have essentially no support for what they're up to at the moment. And as we said in the previous video, we see a big element of distraction in here, and distraction away from the sort of totalitarian rumblings that are happening in the home countries of France, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and others. And that's what we think. Those are the links to some of the material here if you're interested. And there's the third one I particularly recommend. Lou Rockwell, very long article, I haven't read it all, but it looks very, very interesting. We Are Not Useful Idiots, and it goes through the history, and there's many interesting articles on Lou Rockwell if you're not familiar with it. It's a sort of libertarian, anti-war, anti-big government website that actually talks a lot of sense, a lot more sense than you see in the mainstream media. So I hope you found this interesting. Thank you very much for watching. Please like and subscribe it, and share, most importantly, if you enjoyed this, because I think we're being choked a little bit on the Google search results. Okay, thank you. Bye.